Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take a stack of dense sources, extract the most important nuggets of knowledge and insight, and give you a shortcut to being truly well-informed.
Today, we are immersing ourselves in a city that really forces you to confront history, beauty, and decay all at the same time. It's a place that has been a military bastion, a global financial hub, and a frozen architectural museum, often all at once.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're deep diving into Havana, tracing its complex and really contradictory identity. Our sources cover 5 centuries, from 16th century Spanish fortifications all the way to the struggles of its 21st century economy.
Exactly.
Our mission is to understand how a city that was once the single most important strategic hub in the entire Western Hemisphere became the architecturally magnificent yet, economically fragile capital of modern Cuba.
And the city's historic designation provides the perfect frame for this analysis. For centuries, Havana was formally titled Key to the New World and Rampart of the West Indies.
That title wasn't just ceremonial, was it?
Not at all. It was a concise summary of its military and economic reality. You literally could not sail safely across the Atlantic without stopping here. It was the choke point.
And what's fascinating is that you can still map that entire 500-year history onto the physical space of modern Havana, which our sources tell us divides pretty neatly into 3 distinct zones.
Exactly. Understanding these 3 cities is essential to navigating the material. First, you have Old Havana, or Habana Vieja.
The historic core.
Right, the original Spanish core, defined by narrow streets, high walls, and colonial Baroque architecture. It's now, of course, a UNESCO World Heritage Site.
Then you jump forward almost 3 centuries in style and layout to Vedado.
And it's a real jump. Vedado is the uptown section developed in the 20th century. It's built on a modernist grid plan, famous for its high-rises, its Art Deco styles, and, historically, its reputation as a commercial and nightlife center.
And finally, the sprawling newer suburban districts.
Yeah, these areas, including places like Marianao and Miramar, they spread mostly to the west and comprise the modern residential and industrial zones. Miramar, in particular, is still the most exclusive area. That's where you'll find the embassies and upscale facilities.
So we're not just studying one city, but really 3 distinct architectural and historical layers just stacked right on top of each other. So let's start with the founding of Havana in the 16th century. It's easy to assume such an important capital was established perfectly on the first try, but that wasn't the case at all.
No, it wasn't. The initial founding by Diego Velázquez in 1514 was as San Cristobal de la Habana, and it was placed on the south coast near the Mayabeque River.
Right.
But that location was, well, it was strategically poor. It wasn't until 1519 that the settlement was permanently relocated.
Why relocation? Was it just a better port?
It was the perfect port. They moved it to what was then called Puerto de Carenas, which means careening port. The natural harbor there is deep, it's incredibly well protected, and it's large enough to safely shelter entire fleets of enormous Spanish galleons.
So that's the key.
That is the single most important factor that defined Havana's entire history. This relocation gave Spain the crucial logistical asset it needed for its transatlantic trade routes, a safe assembly point for the treasure fleets returning home.
Speaking of its name, the origin of Habana is pretty compelling.
It is. The theory is that Habana is derived from Habaguanex, who was the chief of a local Taino-speaking group. So it points right back to the indigenous populations that occupied the area before the Spanish ever arrived.
And there's a fascinating linguistic footnote here about how the name is pronounced and written globally.
There is. We use the English spelling Havana with a V, but in Spanish, it is Habana with a B. This difference is often attributed to the linguistic phenomenon known as betacism, which is this typical assimilation of the B and V sounds in most modern Spanish dialects.
A subtle shift, but it shows how centuries of phonetic drift shape a global identity. So once it was established in that perfect harbor, the city immediately became a linchpin of global trade, which, of course, also made it a massive, irresistible target for Spain's enemies.
It was the choke point of the New World economy. All the silver from Peru and Mexico, all the tropical goods, had to stop in Havana for provisioning before that long, dangerous voyage across the Atlantic.
So all that concentrated wealth was just a magnet for corsairs.
A huge magnet. And the most dramatic demonstration of that vulnerability came really early on.
In 1555.
Yes. The French corsair Jacques de Sore launched a devastating attack. He didn't just raid the city, he looted it, and then he burned it to the ground. This wasn't just a loss of wealth, it was a profound blow to Spanish prestige and security.
Wow. I mean, that level of destruction had to trigger a fundamental change in Spanish policy, right? Moving from just settlement to full-scale military engineering.
It did, completely. The crown realized that relying on local militia was, well, it was useless. King Philip II personally funded the construction of massive, permanent defensive structures, and these monumental forts served two vital connected purposes.
Okay, one is obvious. Pirates. What's the other?
The other was enforcing economic control.
How do the forts do that?
Well, Seville had a royal monopoly on all trade with the colonies, but the lack of supply and the high prices fueled a booming black market, or contrabando. By building these massive defenses, the Spanish could physically channel all legitimate trade and strictly limit any illicit access to the harbor.
So the forts were customs houses and police stations as much as they were bastions against invasion.
Precisely. And to cement this importance, in 1592, King Philip II granted Havana the full title of city.
As we move into the 17th century, Havana physically expands. What did the city look and feel like during this era?
It was a blend of necessity and an emerging colonial style. Early buildings were constructed primarily from local wood, blending Iberian and Canarian architectural influences. This is when key institutions were established, like the Convent of St. Augustine.
And the defense construction continued.
It never ceased. The early phases of the iconic El Morro Castle are underway, but this relentless expansion was met by a profound crisis mid-century.
Right, the epidemic.
Yes, the year 1649 brought tragedy. A fatal epidemic, imported on a ship from Cartagena, Colombia, just ripped through the population. It killed a devastating 1/3 of all residents.
1 in 3. Imagine the societal paralysis when 1 in 3 of your neighbors, your workers, your family members just vanished.
It must have been terrifying. And it created this huge psychological push to complete the physical defenses. The construction of the massive city walls began in 1674, although they were such a monumental undertaking that they weren't fully completed until 1740.
Now we enter the 18th century, which was really the golden age of colonial Havana. The scale of the city is just astonishing when you put it in context.
It was a colossal global city. By the mid-18th century, its population surpassed 70,000. And to put that in perspective for you, that made it the third largest city in the entire Americas.
And it was comfortably larger than both Boston and New York City at the time.
That's the key fact.
Wait, Havana was larger than New York City in the mid-18th century? That completely reframes its status in the New World. It wasn't just some port, it was a center of power.
More than that, it was an industrial powerhouse. Havana was Spain's largest and most active shipyard in the New World, and the only place they maintained a functioning dry dock. This shipbuilding capacity was vital.
So they were building the very instruments of global naval dominance right there.
They were. Spain was able to construct almost 50% more ships of the line here than in any other Spanish dockyard during that period.
This apex of power made it an irresistible prize in the 7 Years' War. The British launched one of the most significant assaults in the history of the Caribbean.
The scale of the 1762 British invasion was massive. They committed a fleet of more than 50 ships and an army of over 11,000 combined Royal Navy and Army personnel. The siege lasted 2 grueling months.
And what was the immediate social and economic effect of the British actually capturing the city, however briefly?
The occupation, which lasted less than a year, was a shockwave. The British immediately broke the long-standing Spanish trade monopoly, opening Havana up to commerce with their North American and Caribbean colonies.
So suddenly, Cuban planters and merchants could deal freely.
Exactly. And this taste of open trade caused a rapid, short-lived transformation, and it showed many elite Cubans the potential wealth that existed outside the rigid Spanish system.
But Spain got their key back.
They did, though it cost them. The Peace of Paris Agreement in 1763 saw Britain return Havana to Spain in exchange for Florida, but Spain learned the lesson from the capture. The city must be rendered absolutely impregnable.
And this led to a massive, expensive project to create the single most defended city in the Americas.
They spared no expense. Spain transformed Havana into what was arguably the most heavily fortified city in the New World. The crowning achievement was the fortress of San Carlos de la Cabaña.
And La Cabaña was just enormous.
It was huge. Our sources detail its sheer size, noting it was the third biggest Spanish fortification in the Americas, surpassed only by 2 structures in San Juan, Puerto Rico. It was a massive linear fortress designed to command the high ground east of the harbor and protect the city from a landward attack.
And as this era closed, Havana hosted the temporary remains of a historical giant.
Yes, in a final historical anecdote, the remains of Christopher Columbus were transferred to the island in 1796. They rested there until 1898, a period that almost perfectly spans the final century of Spain's direct control over Cuba.
Moving into the 19th century, Havana seems to pivot. It maintains its strategic importance, but it shifts its identity from a military bastion to this center of refinement and culture, earning that famous nickname.
It became widely known as the Paris of the Antilles, and this was fueled by intense commercial prosperity. Increased trade, not just with Europe, but also with North America and the Caribbean, brought vast wealth to the local merchant class and the sugar planters.
So what did this cultural prosperity look like on the ground?
It manifested in a surge of high culture and lavish architecture. The city erected grand structures like the Takan Theater, which became a premier venue in the Americas, attracting the world's most distinguished performing artists.
And the growing middle and upper classes commissioned these expensive new neoclassical mansions.
Exactly. It gave the city a distinctly European, cosmopolitan feel. And this era of prosperity wasn't just about culture. It was about technological advancement that put Cuba firmly ahead of its neighbors.
That's the crucial point.
In 1837, Cuba achieved a major technological milestone. It became the 5th country in the world and the first Spanish-speaking country to establish a functional railroad.
That's just phenomenal. To be only behind the UK, the US, France, and Belgium, it speaks to the immense capital and trade volume flowing through Havana at that time.
It shows where Spain's priorities and the economic might of the local elite lay. And this rapid metropolitan growth necessitated a major symbolic and physical change: the demolition of the city walls.
The walls, which had defined and protected the city for over a century, came down in 1863. That must have been a monumental moment.
It was a transition from the city as a closed fortress to the city as an expanding metropolis. The walls were seen as a physical constraint on progress and commerce, and their removal allowed the city to physically expand and integrate the new suburbs that were emerging.
We have to pause here to acknowledge the profound contradiction that underpinned all of this 19th century glamour.
Absolutely. This economic flourishing, the neoclassical mansions, the technological leaps, it was all fundamentally reliant on the institution of slavery, which remained legal in Cuba until 1886.
And that fact made Cuba an object of intense strategic interest for external forces, too. You're referring to the plans by American pro-slavery groups.
Yes. Our sources mention the Knights of the Golden Circle, a deeply expansionist pro-slavery group in the U.S. They planned to create an empire centered on Havana, extending into the Caribbean and Central America.
So they saw Havana as the natural, wealthy hub for an enduring slave economy.
A vision that was only curtailed by the outcome of the American Civil War.
The end of the century brought a violent end to the Spanish era, culminating in that pivotal moment in the harbor.
The sinking of the U.S. battleship Maine in 1898, anchored right in Havana's port, was the direct catalyst for the Spanish-American War. The war resulted in Spain's final departure from the Americas, marking the transition into the Republic era from 1902 to 1959.
Shifting into the Republic, Cuba was advanced compared to its Caribbean neighbors, yet our sources reveal a society riddled with deep structural contradictions that were magnified by Havana's centrality.
The disparity was astonishing. If you look at social indicators, the country had the highest ratio of hospital beds to population in the entire Caribbean.
Which sounds fantastic on paper.
Right, but when you look closer, 80% of those beds were concentrated in Havana. Meanwhile, the rest of the vast rural island might have had a single 10-bed hospital for an entire region.
That concentration suggests a deliberate political strategy. Was this pattern unique to healthcare, or did the concentration of power and resources in Havana define the Republic era across the board?
It defined the Republic. The economy, infrastructure, political power, it all flowed to and centered on the capital. This created profound economic and social friction.
For instance, Cuba had extensive labor union privileges.
Extremely strong unions, including outright bans on dismissals and restrictions on mechanization in certain industries. This benefited unionized workers in Havana's factories and ports immensely.
But this came at a huge social cost.
It did. The sources highlight that these protections often came at the cost of the unemployed and the peasants who lacked representation and access to these urban benefits. At the same time, the growing middle class, many of whom were university graduates, grew dissatisfied due to high unemployment and increasing political corruption.
So the system was generating great wealth and opportunity, but only for a very narrowly defined segment of the population concentrated in the capital.
Exactly.
Moving to the international stage, Havana briefly returned to geopolitical prominence during World War II.
Yes, in 1940, Havana hosted the crucial Havana Conference. 21 American nations met there to agree on a unified policy regarding territories in the Americas occupied by Axis powers. It was a testament to Havana's perceived neutrality and strategic importance.
Now let's turn to media leadership. The pre-revolutionary era was a time of impressive technological adoption, making Cuba a genuine pioneer in broadcasting.
An absolute pioneer. Cuba was the first Latin American country to introduce television, starting regular commercial broadcasting in 1950. And this wasn't some slow rollout either.
And the expansion was incredibly rapid, putting Cuba in a global leadership position.
By 1954, the CMQ TV network had established 7 stations across the island. This made Cuba the second country in the world, following only the United States, to have a fully national television network.
Wow. That tells you about the level of capital investment and technical expertise that existed in Havana at the time.
It does. And the radio network was just as influential, providing the shared cultural narrative for the entire country. The CMQ radio network was immensely popular throughout the 1940s and 50s. They broadcast hugely influential programs, including a soap opera called El Derecho de Nacer,
The Right to be Born.
which became one of the most popular radio dramas in global history, listened to all across Latin America. This advanced media infrastructure reflected a highly sophisticated, if unequal, society operating right before the political system broke down.
The physical structure of Havana tells the story of its history, culminating in those 3 distinct urban zones we mentioned earlier. Let's start with the one most people visualize: Old Havana.
Old Havana, or Habana Vieja, is the traditional historical core. It's physically constrained, defined by its UNESCO World Heritage designation since 1982. Visually, you should think of narrow shaded streets, colonial plazas that were the heartbeat of 17th and 18th century life, and those iconic, overhanging balconies that almost touch across the street.
Designed to shade the thoroughfares, this is the city of the Spanish crown.
Exactly. Then moving beyond the old city limits, we hit the 20th century in Vedado. How does that transition feel physically?
It's immediate and jarring.
It is. Vedado operates on a modern orthogonal street grid. It was developed primarily between 1930 and 1960 and became the center for high-rise commercial life and glamorous nightlife. The architecture here is characterized by smooth, streamlined Art Deco and early modernism.
They shift from narrow, dark colonial streets to broad, breezy avenues and high-rise hotels.
Completely different feeling. And the third phase, the suburban districts, like Miramar.
These zones, largely spreading west and developed as affluent residential and industrial areas, are characterized by larger lots and more secluded housing.
And Miramar specifically evolved into the most exclusive area. Even today, its wide avenues and substantial villas house the foreign embassies and upscale facilities, marking it as a geographically distinct space.
Switching to administration, Havana acts as both a city and a province. What's the practical reality for the local government structure?
Well, the city operates under severe centralization. It has very little fiscal or political autonomy, relying heavily on the national government and the Communist Party of Cuba for its budgeting and direction.
Yet, our sources mention a degree of local electoral competition. How does that work within a centralized system?
It happens at the very local level. Delegates are elected to municipal assemblies, and these elections are competitive, meaning there has to be a minimum of 2 candidates on the ballot, and the candidates do not necessarily have to be Communist Party members.
Okay.
These delegates then form people's councils, 105 of which exist in Havana. These councils are the government's grassroots arm, directly responsible for neighborhood affairs. They are the crucial link between national policy and what happens on your block.
Let's turn back to the architecture that defines Old Havana, starting with the dominant styles of the colonial era: Spanish and Cuban Baroque.
The Baroque period is defined by defense and devotion. We still see massive military fortifications like the Castillo del Príncipe and the Fortress San Salvador de la Punta.
And the high point of Cuban Baroque.
That would have to be the Havana Cathedral, constructed between 1748 and 1777. Its ornate, asymmetrical facade is universally recognized as the best example of Cuban Baroque. It's built of coral stone, which gives it this unique, almost spongy texture.
And there is a remarkable anecdote attached to the Iglesia del Espíritu Santo.
This small, simple church, also built of coral stone, is significant for its catacombs, but its historical status is truly unique. In 1773, King Charles III of Spain issued a royal certificate declaring it the only immune church in this city.
What did that mean, immune?
It was a rare privilege. Anyone being persecuted could find amparo or sanctuary inside its walls, protected from arrest by the authorities or the justice system. It was a physical manifestation of mercy built right into the city fabric.
Following the Baroque opulence, neoclassicism arrived, bringing French influences to the residential architecture of the wealthy.
This style became dominant among the rising class of habaneros who were getting rich from the sugar trade in the mid-19th century. The pinnacle of this style is the Aldama Palace, built in 1844, considered Cuba's most important neoclassical residential building.
It's defined by those spacious interior courtyards and grand columned portales.
Right, those covered porches that wrap around the structure, providing shade and ventilation. And Havana briefly employed the chief urban planner of Paris to try and organize the growing metropolis.
Jean-Claude Nicolas Forestier.
Yes, he was brought in from 1925 to 1930 to bring Parisian elegance and efficiency to the city. His goal was to harmonize the built environment with the tropical landscape.
Right.
However, his ambitious plans were significantly curtailed by the onset of the Great Depression.
The 1920s and 30s brought Art Deco, which visually defines that early Vedado area.
The Art Deco movement captured the confidence and modern spirit of pre-revolutionary Havana. The ultimate representation is the Bacardi building, completed in 1930.
Originally the headquarters for Bacardi rum.
Exactly. It is celebrated as one of Latin America's finest examples of Art Deco, known for its lavish use of marble, granite, and intricate detailing. This building truly screams international capital and opulence.
And this era of high-rise confidence reached its zenith in the 1950s with modernist structures.
We see iconic structures like the Havana Hilton, now the Tripana Libre, and the Radio Centro CMQ building. The Radio Centro, in particular, was modeled after Manhattan's Rockefeller Center, symbolizing Cuba's firm place in the American sphere of influence.
But the single most compelling structure that symbolizes the technological ambition of the 1950s has to be the FOCSA building.
Oh, absolutely. The FOCSA building, completed in 1956, is critical to understanding pre-revolutionary Havana's self-image. Designed by Ernesto Gomez-Semper and his team, it was a massive 35-story residential block inspired by Corbusier's concept of a city within a city.
A city within a city built for who? And what did that encompass?
It was built for the rising professional and middle class. It contained 400 apartments, garages, a small school, a supermarket, and a luxury top-floor restaurant. Everything residents needed in one vertical community. But what truly makes it a feat of engineering is its structure.
Right. Get this. It was, at the time, the tallest high-strength concrete structure in the world, built entirely without a steel frame.
It's an incredible technical achievement for the era.
What does an engineering feat like that tell you about the state of Cuban capital and engineering confidence in the mid-1950s?
It shows supreme, almost reckless confidence. They had the capital, the local expertise, and the global connections to build something technologically groundbreaking. It was a statement that Havana was not just keeping up, it was leading.
Yet, the story of Havana architecture quickly shifts from confident construction to pervasive decay.
The change post-1959 was dramatic. Due to rapid nationalization, the U.S. embargo, and a centralized economic model that prioritized other things over maintenance, there has been a severe lack of upkeep. This neglect has led to widespread structural deterioration and tragically frequent building collapses.
And there was a clear, symbolic architectural loss right at the start of the revolution.
That was the demolition of the Plaza del Vapor in 1959. This central marketplace, built in 1835, was a structure of immense architectural and cultural importance. The revolutionary government declared it unhealthy and politically undesirable and tore it down.
The parallel to the fate of Les Halles in Paris is striking, a piece of urban history eliminated for reasons of political convenience.
It marked a clear break with the past, imposing a new order. It was a statement that the past, however beautiful, could be erased.
But there are massive efforts now to reverse some of this physical decline, largely driven by tourism.
Yes, Havana's historical core is undergoing a multi-million-dollar restoration. This work is meticulously overseen by the Office of the City Historian, often financed by foreign aid and tourism revenues. However, the restoration is highly focused.
So it concentrates on the major plazas and key tourist thoroughfares.
Exactly. The beautiful, restored Havana that tourists see represents less than 10% of Old Havana's area.
Wow.
It's a successful and visually stunning effort, but it is a targeted intervention. It means architectural grandeur and intense physical decay coexist within the same neighborhood, creating one of the city's most acute visual paradoxes.
The transition in the 1960s from the glamorous capitalist Paris of the Antilles to a centrally controlled socialist economy fundamentally redefined Havana's economic role.
It was a rapid and total overhaul. The capitalist free enterprise system was essentially eliminated. All Cuban and U.S.-owned businesses were nationalized by the state. Banking remained state-controlled, centered at the National Bank of Cuba in Havana.
That means the state became the monolithic employer who works for whom in the capital today.
As of the early 2000s, nearly 89% of the formerly recorded labor force worked for state agencies, institutions, or enterprises. Havana remains Cuba's major industrial hub, concentrating on light manufacturing, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, and of course, the state-owned production of Habanos cigars.
And its maritime importance is undiminished.
It is still the nation's primary port, handling a staggering 50% of the country's imports and exports. Geographically, Vedado serves as the modern commercial and financial district, hosting the main bank headquarters and airline offices.
This economy, which had been supported by the Soviet bloc, took a catastrophic, life-altering hit in the early 1990s. We need to spend time detailing the impact of the special period.
The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 meant the immediate and abrupt termination of billions of dollars in subsidies, cheap oil, and essential trade. This was a sudden, devastating shock that initiated what is known as the special period in time of peace.
What did that economic deterioration look and feel like for the average habanero?
Life fundamentally changed overnight. There were massive shortages of everything: food, medicine, and, most importantly, fuel. Public transportation ground to a halt. Power outages became routine. People lost huge amounts of weight. The government was forced to focus almost entirely on survival.
And this collapse directly leads to the paradox of the contemporary economy, especially regarding private enterprise and local income.
Even after some limited private sector allowance was introduced around 2011, private businesses still face high failure rates. And this is the central paradox. The local economy cannot sustain widespread capitalism because the vast majority of residents working for the state average only about $20 per month in official salary.
$20 a month. That explains why there is such a desperate reliance on outside income streams, like remittances or increasingly tourism.
Tourism is the economic engine that Havana relies on today. It's important to remember that Havana has a history as a leading destination. It was the premier Caribbean tourist destination between 1915 and 1930, ironically booming due to U.S. prohibition.
But the U.S. embargo in 1961 killed that industry.
It dropped drastically. The recovery started in the 1980s when the government actively sought foreign investment to build new hotels. This led to a major rebound. And what's fascinating is that this tourism is diversified. Havana is a major health tourism destination, attracting foreign patients for specialized treatments.
Let's discuss the social landscape now. The government avoids the term poverty.
They prefer at risk or vulnerable. They argue that conventional poverty, where lack of income equates to a total lack of opportunity, doesn't exist due to the country's comprehensive social safety net. We call it social leveling.
So what does this precarious housing stock look like for nearly 10% of the population?
The most dramatic example is the Solares or Corderia. These are the decaying colonial-era mansions or older hotels that have been legally subdivided, sometimes housing 50 or 60 families in cramped, precarious units. Over 9% of the population lives in these highly deteriorated shared spaces.
And then you have shanty towns, which house about 3.3%.
Right. And this is the ultimate social paradox. You have architectural structures originally built for the elite neoclassical palaces, now housing dozens of low-income families in physically dangerous conditions.
Yet the crucial distinction is that residents of these solares or shanty towns still have access to the same high-quality, free education, free healthcare, secure job opportunities, and social security as those who live in formerly affluent areas. That is the leveling component.
It's a profound contradiction.
Turning to demographics, Havana is a massive urban center.
It holds nearly 20% of Cuba's total population. The ethnic breakdown, according to the 2012 census, shows the majority identifying as white, about 58.4%, largely of Spanish descent, followed by mestizo mulatto at 26.4%, and black at 15.2%.
And the distinction about the Tino population is crucial for understanding Cuba's current ethnic makeup compared to the rest of Latin America.
It's vital. Unlike Mexico or Peru, Cuba has relatively few mestizos because the indigenous Tino population was almost entirely wiped out by Eurasian diseases very early in the colonization period.
What about internal migration? With the concentration of resources in Havana, people must be trying to move here constantly.
They are, but the government imposes controls on movement into the already densely populated and infrastructure-strained metropolitan area. This results in significant internal tension, particularly concerning internal migrants from the eastern region of Oriente. These migrants are sometimes informally and quite loadedly nicknamed Palestinos.
A term that highlights the strained resources and internal friction.
Exactly.
We mentioned earlier that the health system is strong despite economic challenges. Let's focus on those indicators again.
The emphasis remains on primary care and prevention. All residents have free access to health care, often delivered by neighborhood family doctors who serve an average of 170 families each. This gives Cuba one of the highest doctor-to-patient ratios globally.
And that system produces results comparable to developed nations.
Yes. Havana's infant mortality rate in 2009 was 4.9 per 1,000 live births. To give you context, that rate is better than some developed countries and consistently the lowest in the developing world. Education is similarly prioritized free and compulsory through secondary level, anchored by the prestigious University of Havana established in 1728.
And a cultural institution that draws global talent.
The Cuban National Ballet School. With 4,350 students, it is one of the largest and most prestigious ballet schools in the world, reflecting a continuous state commitment to arts education and cultural diplomacy.
Let's ground ourselves again in the geography. That perfect harbor, protected by the Straits of Florida, is Havana's defining physical feature.
It is. Havana lies on the northern coast, right at the intersection of the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic. The bay is entered through that narrow inlet that was so easily defended by El Morro and La Punta, but then it expands into three deep, well-sheltered inner harbors.
And the climate is typical tropical savanna, but what about natural disasters? Is it highly exposed?
It's a tropical savanna climate, with average temperatures ranging from 22 degrees C in January to 28 degrees C in August. While the whole island is vulnerable, Havana is usually spared the worst of the hurricanes, as they generally strike the south coast.
But weather extremes have begun to assert themselves recently.
Yes. While major hurricanes usually bypass the capital, Hurricane Ian in 2022 still approached near hurricane strength, causing significant damage. However, the most unusual and devastating weather event was the 2019 EF4 tornado.
Tornadoes of that strength are incredibly rare in the Caribbean.
Unusually violent. It struck the eastern side of Havana, killing 4 people and injuring 195. It was the first F4 or EF4 tornado recorded in Cuba since 1940, highlighting a new, unpredictable vulnerability.
Moving to transportation, the city's network is extensive, built during those boom years, but suffering badly today.
The road network, including the Autopista Nacional, is extensive but severely deteriorated due to the lack of maintenance funds since the special period. The national rail network still connects Havana to all provinces, but the quality of service is highly variable.
And the most ambitious transportation dream remains a literal abandoned scar on the landscape.
That would be the abandoned metro dream. In the 1980s, during Cuba's closest relationship with the Soviet Union, there were advanced plans to build a Moscow-like underground subway system for Havana.
Cuban, Czech, and Soviet specialists completed extensive studies.
They did. And actual construction had begun in the late 1980s. But when the Soviet Union collapsed, what happened?
The project died immediately.
The massive funding and technical expertise evaporated overnight. The abandoned metro system is one of the clearest physical testaments to the abrupt and brutal shift in Cuba's economic dependence, a symbol of what might have been.
Just rusted equipment and half-dug tunnels.
That's it. Yet one historical line still operates, which is incredible given the challenges.
The Hershey Electric Railway.
This interurban line was built in 1917 by the Hershey Chocolate Company to transport sugarcane and employees. Today, it remains operational, running from Casablanca across the bay from Old Havana all the way to Matanzas. It's a historical anomaly, a functioning remnant of the American industrial era.
Finally, let's explore Havana as a center of arts and culture.
It is a powerhouse. The Museo Nacional de Bellas Artes de La Habana holds one of Latin America's largest art collections, with over 45,000 pieces. They dedicate one building entirely to Cuban art history and another to universal art.
And the performing arts have a global heritage.
The Gran Teatro de La Habana, established in 1837, is the historic heart of Cuban performance. Its stage has hosted legends like Enrico Caruso and Anna Pavlova. It is currently home to the National Ballet of Cuba, indelibly associated with the legendary Cuban prima ballerina absoluta and choreographer Alicia Alonso.
What's fascinating here is how the entire history we've discussed is summarized in a single visual emblem. Havana's coat of arms.
The coat of arms is the perfect visual synthesis of this deep dive. It features three castles, Fuerza, Morro, and Punta, which definitively represent the city's defensive history. Most crucially, in the center is a key, symbolizing Havana's role as the definitive gateway, or key to the New World.
As we end, let's mention those massive landmarks that define the modern skyline.
We have to mention the Malcon, the iconic seawall avenue that curves around the Atlantic coast, famous for social life and sunsets. El Capitolio Nacional, built in 1929, now houses the Cuban Academy of Sciences. The necropolis Cristobal Colon is an astonishing sight, an elaborate 19th century open-air museum with nearly 1 million tombs.
And watching over the city from the east side of the bay is the gigantic Christ of Havana statue.
Completed in 1958, a final statement of pre-revolutionary cultural confidence.
So what does this all mean for you, the learner? We have traced Havana's journey from a mosquito-ridden Spanish outpost to a global colonial choke point, a glamorous Paris of the Antilles, and ultimately to a centralized state capital grappling with decades of economic shock.
The central narrative tension is the contrast between the city's historical role and its present reality. History endowed it with unparalleled strategic importance and architectural grandeur, from the coral stone churches to the concrete monolith of the FOCSA building.
And that past now stands in stark contrast with the current struggle. Low, state-controlled salaries and severe physical decay in the urban core.
We see the high indicators of social achievement, world-class health and education metrics, coexisting with the profound economic fragility where private enterprise struggles because the local population averages only $20 a month in wages.
The past is magnificent, but the present is complicated.
Very. And the restoration efforts are limited, though spectacular, and intrinsically tied to the tourism economy, focusing on the facades and plazas most visible to the outside world. Meanwhile, the reality for the majority of residents is navigating life within a highly centralized system, living in decaying mansions and dealing with failing infrastructure.
Like those rusted remnants of the abandoned metro dream.
Exactly. The layers of history are visible everywhere, from the ancient military fortifications to the Art Deco high-rises.
So this raises an important question for you to consider as you reflect on this city's long and complicated history.
As Havana increasingly relies on the outside world for the capital needed to save its physical structure, how will the pressures of 21st century global tourism and economics combined with the city's unique political structure determine whether Havana remains the dynamic, essential key to the New World, or if it becomes a painstakingly restored, beautiful, but ultimately frozen historical relic?
A perfect, provocative thought to end our deep dive into this incredible city of layers. Thank you for joining us.